Hi, everyone, and welcome to Afems 2021. Wow, it's been an absolute journey. I mean, there was that small thing of that global pandemic that happened, but we're here, and yeah, it's been an absolute ride. Um, all things considered, I think we're super happy to be here, and we're expecting this kind of bumper edition. Um, First off the bat, welcome to everyone who's here. So many gorgeous faces that I'm looking at, even in this room today. And I just want to also welcome everyone who is online, whose faces we actually can't see. Old folks who are returning year after year, who's part of our Afems community, our Afems family who support us, and new friends and family that we are going to be making over the space of this week. We want to thank you for your continued support, and we welcome all the kinds of feminist allegiances that we are going to be making. I really want to thank all of those who are making this week possible. Afems was started in 2017, and it was an invitation really to just have a little seminar, and that invitation was overwhelming, and Afems was born at that point in Makanda at Rhodes University with Linda Jitanda Spencer and Tando and Giovanni. And since then, year on year, it has grown. And last year, that invitation was taken up by our sisters here in the Western Cape, Kanita Mohammed, Mandisa Hahoff, Nomusa Makubu, under the leadership of Polo Moji. Yeah, absolute. An absolute driving force. And then when they, and we welcomed the possibility of extending our that network here to the Western Cape. And then COVID hit. And that didn't stop them. Last year we had an absolutely brilliant digital event, and that allowed us to use our feminist archive in the most incredible way. And to then have, amidst all of this, and we know that year 2 of COVID has been just as daunting, if not more daunting than year 1. And for us to be having this bumper edition of Afems just speaks to the sheer determinism of these amazing women that I'm speaking to. And I really, just from the get-go, I want to just give a round of applause for all of them. So I already want to cry, but I'm going to stop because I already started crying the moment I walked in here and I saw a table with Cool Life and their products, and Yvette Abrams sitting there knitting away, and she's one of my idols. And the fact that you can just walk into a space and see that kind of sight, that's Afems. And so I already burst into tears already. And Gertrude Fester out there putting up an installation. This is what Afems is about. And so we have this amazing program, and I just want to hand over to Polo to just talk us through this, and to do the kind of institutional welcome, and to thank UCT for just having us, and for having Afems, and for creating this wonderful 5-day event. Not event, this wonderful feast that we're about to have over this next week.
Thank you. Thank you, Charlene. I actually don't know how to follow that up. I mean, that was amazing. I am just going to speak really briefly and say that for those of us who've always attended Afems, this is a community that feeds us. And it was just something we've looked forward to. We look forward to every year, just reconnecting with each other and being in community. And such a special space that it was an absolute honor really an absolute honor to be able to bring it to the Western Cape, to UCT. And I say the Western Cape because we were very clear about wanting to ensure and embrace that our community with the University of the Western Cape and with Stellenbosch University as well, which is why we are having workshops for UCT students, UWC students, as well as Stellenbosch students on the different days this week. So that was really intentional on our part, because we were saying, you know, we've also got this wonderful community here, and we need more conversation, I think, between us. So let's start this week in conversation. Let's remain in community, and let me just thank our wonderful main sponsors this year, the Ford Foundation, because this hybrid event would not have been possible without them and without their generosity. I want to thank UCT Conference Management and the UCT University of Cape Town itself for giving us a space to host this event. And before I introduce my dean, Shose Kesi, Professor Shose Kesi, who will give the institutional welcome, I'm just going to give a brief rundown of this morning's program for the benefit of those in the room and for the benefit of those who are watching online. So this morning, this opening program is live. We will start with the keynote and go into a tea coffee session, which will during which we'll be streaming a book launch, Vladimir Tola's The Female Fear Factory. Thereafter, we'll have 2 live panels. This morning, each an hour long. The first, Unsilenced Bodies. The chairpersons will present them in detail, and the second one on decolonial praxis. Thereafter, we take a break, and we take a pause, and we will start again at 3 in the afternoon with the Zoom programming for the day. And this is how the days are going to work. Monday to Thursday will be live and streamed. Thereafter, from 3 o'clock, we will be on Zoom until 6:30 in the evening. So without further ado, please Associate Professor Shose Kesi for a few words of welcome.
Okay, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm going to do and thank everybody again. But also it's my job to welcome you all to the African Feminism Conference for 2021. 5 years ago, on the 9th of September 2016, Professor Angela Davis delivered the 17th Steve Biko Memorial Lecture at the University of South Africa. It was a momentous occasion for many currently involved in the struggle to transform and decolonize higher education in South Africa. To hear an inspirational Black woman revolutionary speak with such clarity, incisiveness, and wisdom on the struggles we are living and witnessing in this contemporary moment. The Soweto uprisings of June 16, 1976 are an integral part of present activisms, which Angela Davis eloquently highlights in her talk entitled Legacies and Unfinished Activisms. As she reflects on the legacies of the past, she reminds us of the significance of past struggles in creating new dynamics of struggle, which we are witnessing across the higher education landscape globally, as well as society more broadly. These new dynamics of struggle include the recentering of Black women in narratives of struggle and change. Feminists from Africa and the diaspora have long described the erasure of women from histories of Black revolutionary thought. African feminist thinking offers a historical perspective that centers the experiences and leadership of Black women who deliver a multi-layered and multi-dimensional and transnational understanding of what it means to be Black and woman. Angela Davis reminded us that day that women have always been at the center of anti-racist progressive action, despite male-dominated liberation movements' attempts to dismiss the woman question as divisive. There is so much to be learned from African feminisms. In my own research and now my work as a university administrator, I have found that Black feminist theories and practices have been the most effective to equip ourselves with the technologies for activist work. I have learned that within the confines of institutional systems inherited from the past, lasting change is slow and incremental and only happens through the acts of people who make collective demands for change. I have learned too that change only happens if we are able and willing to imagine alternatives and view current realities as malleable and transformable. Finally, of course, one needs staying power and the ability to constantly and consistently recognize everyday forms of violence. And that is only possible through the collaboration, solidarity, and support of others. Colleagues, let us lead with courage, care, patience, and integrity. As Angela Davis has said, you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. I believe the Afems conference is one such event that can inspire all of us to keep doing what we do all the time. Looking at the program and the attendees, we see a glittering array of scholars, artists, performers, and writers. And this rare meeting of so many incredibly talented minds comes about because of the dedication and vision of many people. Great credit is due to Professor Linda Spencer of the Department of Literary Studies in English at Rhodes University, Professor Charlene Khan of the Fine Arts Department at Wits University, for conceptualizing this gathering and bringing so many critical thinkers around one table and doing so every year since 2017. I would like to thank Professor Spencer, Professor Khan, and all the conveners of this year's conference, Dr. Polo Moji, Kanita Mohammed, Dr. Mandisa Hahoff, Professor Nomusa Makubu, and Aika Swai, who have put together a marvelous and engaging program that is packed with insights from all corners of the humanities, arts, and social sciences spectrum. Allow me also to extend a special welcome to our keynote speakers, Matsilo Motsei, Professor Peace Bigua, and Professor Tiffany Willoughby-Herard. Your insights are keenly anticipated, and we are delighted that you will present at Afems this year. We are also privileged to witness the launches of no fewer than 5 books over the coming week. This is incredible, actually, and is testament to the quality of scholars we have in our midst. I want to congratulate all the authors, and we are looking forward to learning about your hard work. And thank you also to the sponsors who supported this event. This kind of platform is sorely needed as a key part of the decolonial project. Pushing African feminist scholarship into the foreground is critical to undoing the ties that bind not only the canon, but the mindset of society at large. Academic scholarship in particular has been complicit in the production and reproduction of racialized and gendered knowledge, and many disciplines have maintained a Eurocentric focus and worked to maintain a heteropatriarchal status quo. In many of our disciplines, the white, heterosexual, middle-class, able-bodied, cisgendered male experience is the position from which generalizations and theorizations have been produced and cast as normative. What has considered to be African and feminist issues have been largely marginalized or pathologized in the production of academic knowledge. All the work to be presented at this conference serves to reinforce the reality that African feminism, at its heart, is not just about reimagining the role of African women in society, but about reframing our scholarship in a way that acknowledges our agency and leadership. It is a privilege to be able to host the Afems conference at UCT. which comes at a particularly opportune time as we prepare to launch the Department of African Feminist Studies in 2022. The many ways in which you all have approached this task will impact on many far beyond this conference. Every paper that is presented, every conversation, every network that is nurtured here is a significant step to realizing the equity and decoloniality that we are working towards. I'm very happy to have been invited to such an important gathering, and all those who are involved should feel a sense of pride at helping nudge us along to where we want and need to be. I'm sure that Afems will continue growing in strength so that we are treated to a treasure trove of knowledge like this every year. I wish you all an engaging and meaningful experience. Thank you.
Many thank you, Jean. I think we're already off to a fantastic start. I would like to call upon Barbara Boswell, who is the Associate Professor in the Department of English Literary Studies, to chair our first opening keynote, which is, again, one of my favorite people in the world. I have many, but this is Professor Tiffany Willoughby Herard. And wow, I've been looking forward to this for 2 years. So Barbara, please indulge us.
Hello everyone, good morning, welcome. It's an honor for me to introduce Tiffany Willoughby Herard this morning. Tiffany Willoughby Herard is an Associate Professor of African American Studies at the University of California at Irvine. She or they is a Black political scientist who focuses on Black political thought and the material conditions of knowledge production, Black movements, South African historiography, Blackness in international relations, diaspora, third world feminisms, decolonizing theory, feminist pedagogy, Black and African feminisms, and racial capitalisms and gendered racisms in international relations. Her current work explores cross-generational youth-led political organizing around land return, sexual violence, and colonial legacies in South Africa. She's concerned with political consciousness across generations and creative sites for political education. She is the author of Waste of a White Skin, The Carnegie Corporation, and The Racial Logic of White Vulnerability, which was published in 2015 by the University of California Press. Willoughby Herard is also the co-editor of numerous journal special issues, a new book on Black feminist cultural studies in contemporary South Africa entitled Sasinda Futhi Siselapa, Black Feminist Approaches to Cultural Studies in South Africa's 25 years since 1994. She's also the author of a textbook, Theories of Blackness on Life and Death, which appeared in 2011. Associate Professor Willoughby Herard is also a poet whose creative writing most recently has appeared in the anthology Wild Imperfections, an anthology of womanist poems edited by Natalia Mulabatsi, and it has just been published this year. Willoughby Herard is a founding member of the Transnational Black Women Scholars of African Politics Research Network and a founding member of the Black Women and Gender Non-Binary Research and Creative Writing Group, In For Us. As president of the 52-year-old National Conference of Black Political Scientists and a member of the LGBTQ+ caucus of the Association for the Study of Black Women in Politics, she has found space to grow as a poet, an editor, a reader, a mama, a member of a church choir, a teacher, an undergraduate research supervisor, a friend, an ethical and grounded political scientist, and a Black internationalist lesbian feminist who survived. Her keynote presentation today is titled From Black Woman Worker to Speak to We Are Those Girls, the Writerly Life of Black women's politics in South Africa. Please welcome Professor Willoughby Herod.
So first, a warm thank you to the Afems organizing committee and the women and gender expansive people who brought me into this space, Dee Marco, Charlene Kahn, and Linda Gakanda Spencer. Thank you to my colleagues, the future Dr. LaShonda Carter and the future Dr. Natalia Molabatsi for traveling with me across time and space. Thank you to Clive and Yvonne and Polo and Mandisa and Yvonne and Kamisa and Numusa and Akia and Carnita. I think I might have said your name twice, Carnita. And to the Dean and to Chair of the Department, Professor Boswell, and to our brave sister, Yvette. I cannot tell you how honored I am to be in the room with you. Thank you for your words, finding me and my students and building nurses and doctors all over California. Thank you. Today, I'm going to be talking about what I'm calling writing is a shrine, writerly practices in Black woman worker, speak, and we are those girls. By way of theory, in pursuit of often marginalized emancipatory projects, our colleague Ntabiseng Motseme's essay, African Women's Lived and Embodied Meanings of Reconciliation and Healing, a research note, explores, quote, what those who had been victimized and brutalized by apartheid do to make their version of the past heard. One of the ways that the figures I explore today take up making their version of the past heard is through what I've come to call writerly practices and writerly lives. By this, I mean the multiple genres in which the ongoing struggle for liberation steals away to reemerge again in contexts in which neocolonialism and symbolic transition are guaranteed. Writerly practices focus on cross-generational political education while operating in the world of what Cedric Robinson called the anti-political. Inviting readers to hear the trauma and violence of raced and gendered settler colonial pro-slavery state terror, but in a different fashion, Motseme turns to the spiritual and cosmological principles of African traditional religions and to African women's stories about the murder of family members in their homes, the burnings and desecrations of the bodies and the remains of victims of torture. Following theologian Dr. Nokuzola Mdende, Motseme writes, quote, the suppression of African traditional religions meant the TRC remained spiritually oppressive to the thousands who came to testify. Though urban township-based African women's stories were heard in the TRC, that hearing was a particularly skewed one. Motseme details what was left out through ethnographic research on urban township community members who sought justice from those hearings and decisions in order to, quote, reappropriate their voices and bodies in their own terms. Through this, Motseme coins a new set of concepts with robust conceptual import and heft. Concepts like diviner's epistemological narrative and lived spiritualities. By hearing from these experiences, Motseme reminds us that households, architecture, spaces, entire communities, landscapes, and relationships to the ancestors are harmed through quotidian forms of state and interpersonal violence. With careful attention to the state and the body, Motseme writes, the brutality of systems such as apartheid could alter the ways individuals and communities relate to each other, how meanings and definitions of relationships in the family between loved ones and neighbors could be transformed and torn to shreds. So given this context, how does one tend to the relationships in the family, the relationships between loved ones and neighbors? How does one create ways to communicate when spoken words are no longer available? Scribbling, scraping, tapping away on keyboards and phones, words that can be planted between covers for hearing when ears are actually ready to receive them. During the TRC, African traditional religions and their approaches to violence, trauma, and restoration of balance after cross-generational institutionalized breaches of decency were not drawn on as deeply moral resources. Instead, these religious systems were marshaled only in as much as they could be conflated with the typically ignored and despised African cultures themselves. African people, explains Motseme in general, and African women in particular, even in their attempts to navigate the TRC with their stories, utilize their own cosmologies, memories, and values to make meaning of their lives and to endure the TRC process and its inability to adjudicate the forms of state manufactured and mediated harms that targeted them. By way of theory, providing a powerful explanation for the meaning of engendering power in the aftermath of the first confirmation of a US Supreme Court judge publicly acknowledged to have engaged in sexual violence, the late American judge Justin A. Leon Higginbotham's open letter to Justice Clarence Thomas from a federal judicial colleague in 1991 noted that, quote, 8 of the present United States Supreme Court justices' lives would not have been very different if the Brown desegregation of public facilities case had never been decided as it was, end quote. Commenting on the impact of a legal decision with almost as much import as the abolition of enslavement, that is for non-incarcerated persons, and the removal of federal troops from the secessionist American South in order to Does Higginbotham's words help us consider the seriousness of Motseme's research questions? In what ways and to what extent did the post-1994 inauguration of a new legal apparatus and set of jurisprudential meanings actually interrupt the lives of those positioned to wield, inherit, and embody white masculine power in a white minority polity on the African continent? I also live in a white minority polity in Northern Africa. That's where I live in the United States. Indeed, this white supremacy yoked political national Christianity in the hands of African clerics and everyday people has become one of the most ubiquitous of these forms of white masculine power, notwithstanding its roots and origins in East Africa. Motseme, like Justice Higginbotham, insists on the reminder that we did not arrive at this moment, whatever its contours, missteps, failures, or achievements, by ourselves, or because of the disbursement of individual rights. To the extent that we wish to caricature the South African past and to justify the forgetting of the greatest and most profound risks undertaken to sustain a multi-generational struggle, we end up ignoring the particular vulnerabilities borne by African women. Experiences that the TRC often exploited while silencing the most enduring and well-articulated calls for legal, social, and cosmological remedies. For Motseme, engendering power for African women in South Africa means taking stock of both their version of the past and listening to the ways in which they secured a hearing. How did those women secure hearing, and who did they seek to be heard by? Did the African women coming to the TRC seek justice from the state, or did they seek justice among the next generations? The justice that can only be served by us, remembering to live their versions of the past heard. One can most certainly hear the thousands upon thousands of women and men and gender non-binary people across the planet who donned the Duke and wore Black for weeks in the Black woman-led social media campaign to memorialize Winnie Mandela, the I Am Winnie Mandela campaign in 2018. These wearers were memorializing someone who was framed as a criminal to the entire world. Framed for punishment, for publicly butchering, rebuffing, rejecting, and denouncing white masculine power, white minority polity, and all the forms of Blackness that internalize these forms of subjection. Those scholars have explored the ways in which criminalization is one possible ontological reality and possibility for African women who claim themselves, as Winnie did. Motseme turns away from white power's desire to make African people forget or feel ashamed of African women and the ways in which African women ascend and heal. Restoring balance to, make meaning with, and accessing cosmology is more than full-time labor. And it is being undertaken in conditions of extreme and nearly totalizing violence. Thus, as in the essay by Motseme that I started with, we are pointed toward careful listening to and with the accounts of African women. Motseme charges us to listen for and seek these accounts of African women, and Higginbotham reminds us that white men in power and their acolytes have not had their practices, behaviors, or hunger for conquest restricted or constrained at all. In fact, they have found new, more pernicious ways to demand consent and things taken most certainly that were never given away. In fact, things which are not alienable or severable at all. But still 20 years on, they take. So if we pivot from African women to Black women, which is required of me because of where I sit in history and geography and spiritual work, say to yourself quietly, slavery. Say to yourself quietly, slavery. Say to someone else in the room, catch their eye and say slavery. If you have a pen in your hand, write down slavery. So if we pivot from African women to Black women, which is required of me because of where I sit in history and geography, and the spiritual work that it takes to do the work of becoming an African woman, work which I have not fully undertaken and cannot achieve until after I return to the ancestors, you might be in pursuit of a woman like Fatima Mir, as I have been. You might have come across her work in a library and picked it up and know as you read the pages that it was conjured to make their version of the past heard. That it might be available to me as an unexpected smuggler and carrier of the contagion of those other paths not taken, those historical conditions slaughtered and wasted away in favor of this present we are suffering under. As far as I can recall, I began to walk with Fatima Mir in 2012 in an American Association of University Women Fellowship application. Then again in 2014 in a talk at the UCLA Gender Studies Institute, and then in 2015 in a first-year one-credit seminar that I taught on Black woman worker, and then in a talk in Ghana in 2015 about the racist call in 1904 to demand self-deportation of people of Indian descent. Later, Mir in 2018 spoke to me about Andrew Zondo and legal representation as narrative and storytelling. And in a post-sabbatical revised and renamed version of my African Gender Studies course that for now and forever, as long as I can tell, will be called African Feminisms because of what Fatima Mir said to me. What began as reading and teaching Fatima Mir's studies and reports and short stories and biographies and prison memoirs and encountering her paintings and drawings in unexpected places was disciplined in reading the definitive biography of Mir, published quite recently by historian Shireen Hassim. It did not read like the works I was more familiar with and had been touching in my race and immigration courses and my African gender studies courses, like Devarakshanam Betty Govindin's Sister Outsiders, the representation of identity and difference in selected writings by South African Indian women, or Rehana Ebrahim Valley's Kalapani, Caste and Color in South Africa, both published in by UNISA Press and Brill in the Social Identities in South Africa series by my mentor and teacher and friend and series editor, Abebe Zageya. As I recall, I spent 4 years teaching Govindin and Ebrahim Valley in conversation with Zine Magubani and Puma Kola and Ntabiseng Motseme and Oyeronke Oyewumi before turning decisively to Mir. According to biographer Hasim, we uncover lessons from Fatima Mir for whom, and I'm going to just give you the formal definitions of who Mir is in that text. Mir for Hasim is someone for whom race was a shifting boundary rather than fixed and binary. Mir was someone who used formal research sociology as an analytical lens concerned with forms of sociality and intimate lives as the source of epistemological and practical insight. Mir sought to uncover historical patterns and structural forces that operated on individuals located at the bottom of the social hierarchy in order to understand how those might account for or explain their views of action to address the race nature of academic work. So the people on the bottom critiquing the academic work. For Mir, existing with her own level of intimacy with race making, the conceptual terrain of Black lives required writing for people who create formal knowledge outside of the racist educational structures of the past and today. And Mir coupled this with the observation that, Hasim coupled this with the characteristic that Mir always focused on the appeal to young people. For Hasim, Mir's political work directed force upward toward the state and community activism, that is what secures food and shelter for the displaced and housing for all and education, force directed horizontally. That's Shireen Hasim's Mir, all of which I agree with. And yet, I found myself constrained and unsettled by my sincerely respected colleague Hasim's unwillingness to take Fatima Mir's focus on Blackness and Indianness and feminism, all political labels, seriously. It's not about her, it's about me. And when I say I seriously respect her, I mean that. This is not a straw man argument, I mean that. I'll tell you more just now. For Hasim, even though Mir's understandings of Blackness and Indianness were created through brutalizing legal and social institutions, the very same Blackness and Indianness were not salient for, quote, radical transformation. This distinction set me on a course of a distracted meta reading of Hasim's biography as I was pressed to investigate why these analytics of the social, Blackness in particular, were being diminished to advance non-racialism. I found myself reacting to certain claims in Hasim's biography because I came to Mir looking for a Black woman social scientist and needing Fatima Mir to be either something she was not or something that might give me groundings in my own turbulent practices of survival and ethical formation through studying intellectual history. In addition to writing about Blackness and Indianness' everyday life worlds that could capture the totality of the whole world, I sought Mir's activism. As consummate Black knowledge. I was looking for her as Black knowledge. These unsettling claims by Hasim include her insistence that Mir prioritized studying racism, but she did not believe that race was meaningful as a category to define human beings. Similarly, Hasim's Fatima Mir was actively engaged in the elite politics of the Natal Indian Congress, focused on incorporation and civil and legal rights, like expanding Indian business expansion and segregated housing. Hasim's Mir moved by reaching beyond narrow class and race confines to create a vision of a just society that was radically transformed, albeit without Blackness and race and feminism. Because as I would contend for Hassim, class and race and feminism are primordial, or perhaps unthinking concerns, thoughtless concerns. Hassim's Mir also defied the political label of feminist while establishing the archive for its study and training feminists to do their best work. Are y'all with me? Okay. Thank you. I needed that. I must disagree with this particular Mir because she is my ancestor too, and I'm in grave need of her memory and writing to do a different kind of work. I'm seeking a grounding with Fatima Mir that accounts for her intimacy with Blackness, her intimacy with poverty, and her intimacy with feminism. How does one build the methodological roadway for Black people to document their material conditions and also destroy those Black people in the process? How does one build an action research sociology that takes Blackness seriously and that encourages Black-led self-defense and Black self-articulation, and then becomes someone who believes that that work is not pertinent to radical transformation? I know sociologists. You all probably know sociologists. Some of you in the room might even be sociologists. Fatima Mir could have done anything and gone a very long way with sociology if Blackness, economic justice, and feminist consciousness were not what she was after. The same Ford Foundation that sponsors us here today is the same Ford Foundation that sponsored the Institute for Black Research then. Instead, Fatima Mir, quite like Fanon, took a social science concerned with the spectacle of captivity under gendered racial capitalism and showed everyday Black people as knowledge makers, knowledge evaluators, self-determining and self-authorizing. I need this Fatima Mir to understand where my own ideas come from and why I am willing to listen to my own path as long as it enshrines and makes me, as jurist Ndomiso Dladla explains, worthy of my African personhood. If Hassim can make a version of Mir, certainly I can read her as well and query why words like Black woman worker sat so well in her body and soul. It is perhaps because I want to be like the version of Mir that I am writing about, that I'm seeking out that reinvocation in her and in myself. See, I'm okay with political labels because in them I see groundings with people who are often murdered and feared rather than heard, often alleged to be carrying guns when they are carrying pens, or as Mumia Abu Jamal says, groundings with people often offered Uzis instead of microphones. That's what political labels offer us. But such labels can read force upward toward the state and force horizontally through the cosmology of Poto Mitan, the human-looking cross-beam pole that is built in Vodun ceremonies to signify a sacred house where the creator is intentionally invited in to transform the human condition. Such political labels simply name energetic forces and antagonisms that are not discontinuous, that are actually part of dynamic wholes. Isn't it so? Now, Dambala is not Jesus and Osiris is not Yemaya, so it's important to be precise with naming. But would it be wrong for us to think of those forces as the ones that we appeal to when broken flesh reveals its miraculousness by being able to be sutured together and to speak as a healed thing, though still remembering the lessons of the breach and the rupture? Let me translate. What I'm getting after is that rattling the force of the state and rattling the force of what makes us strive to build horizontally together are far more linked in Fatima Mir's work. They are linked as fundamentally as Poto Mitan. Trust and believe. In true Lucille Clifton fashion, every nursery school built, every home eviction stopped was a celebration of dynamic, vertical, and horizontal forces in Fatima Meer's life. Poet Lucille Clifton requires me to read Fatima Meer's endurance and missteps as the evidence that, as Clifton writes, every day something has tried to kill me and it has failed. Meer's writerly life denaturalized the conditions produced by the state that inspired suicide, that forced people to rob their psyches and future life years by working 29 hours for every 24-hour cycle, and that counseled judge young people unworthy of their humanity simply for being young. In these ways, Fatima Meer occupied the most volatile and unpredictable point where political work and community activism charge each other. By taking Meer's Blackness seriously, I am able to reckon with the material conditions that shaped her and those she was called to identify with. Those she was called to identify with. 2, an archive of Black women in South Africa. Black women worker, speak, and we are those girls. I'm watching the time. I know I have to end in 5 minutes. It's like trying to deliver like quintuplets in front of people by yourself on the floor or standing. I told Deshonda when we were walking this morning, I don't want to give it. I don't want to. But you have to do what you're asked to do, even when it's heavy and messy and hard. To remind you all of my intervention, the Fatima Meer that I am after traced the history of Black women's political involvement, promoted independent Black women's organizations. The Meer that I am wrestling with called herself a Black woman. And before I went, I was gonna tell you all a story, but maybe we'll share it over a meal later. I have to skip it because I have to get to the cases. I'm trying to urge us to consider that Fatima Meer called herself a Black woman, such that historians must reckon with her articulation of Blackness as capacious enough to give room for exploring anti-Indian discrimination and to reject notions of belonging. So rather than thinking of colored identity and Indian identity as somehow in between, right? It's just about Blackness. We can fight about it. We can just fight about it. What does she say in Black Woman Worker? So that's the first case. It took all of that time to get to the first case. For a very long time, I've been writing about this willingness to see oneself as Black and also to see Blackness as something that's not to be avoided. Concluding research that was launched in 1984, Meer's Black Woman Worker, a study in patriarchy and women production workers in South Africa, raised critical questions about how the concept of gendered Black consciousness articulated with racial colonialism, segregation, and apartheid. They interviewed thousands of women in Pinetown, Durban, and asked them to explain what it meant to be a Black woman worker. She's publishing this at the same time that all the other Black women around the planet are calling themselves Black women workers. And sometimes we think of them as critical race feminists, and sometimes we think of them as transnational feminists. And we've got all of these different articulations, but there is this consistency about drawing on this term and why it is that they choose this particular term. And does the term mean to do a kind of universal flattening, Marxist class building work? Or does it mean to do something else? Does it mean to allow us to do something else? That's what I'm concerned with. So she writes this Black Woman Worker book, and she insists at things like class, race, ethnic, cultural, and family loyalties intervene and counter any call for unity based on the fact of sex alone. She's articulating something like intersectionality, right? She's articulating something like the violence of sitting within a factory, having walked 4 hours and having to decide whether or not you go to the factory, even though your children have no nursery to go to. And then being told that you're not actually a worker at all anyway. So she writes Black woman worker. But then in 1992, her daughter Shameen worked with a feminist community to found and build a newsletter called Speak during a period of the flourishing of alternative media that sought to respond to mainstream media that was primarily pro-apartheid or ambivalent about Black rights. Even this alternative media did not typically foreground women's liberation in the ways that Speak did. Speak amplified hidden women's activism at the local level, the rural women's movement, and women fighting political violence in communities. They gathered the stories from organizations and promoted them on the pages of the newsletter, nationally enabling women in isolated communities to use the pages of experiences of other women in places distant from their own to have a sense that their activism was part of a larger movement. This form of writing and media had an important role to play in articulating and stitching together women's needs, social welfare groups, and movement groups. So women who faced local authorities that refused to build a cemetery for their dead, and women that had to face local authorities to get them to close rubbish dumps, and women that had to face local authorities to get them to stop doing things like coming into their homes and occupying townships, organized and had their stories amplified through Speak. This is Mir's daughter. In the third movement, I take us to We Are Those Girls. Shamim Mir, again, Fatima Mir's daughter, in 2016, works with Nyasha Mkhwane and the NISA Institute for Women's Development to sponsor a 3-day writing workshop for 11th and 12th grade girls. In the workshop, the facilitators use technique-focused creative arts to skill share and to affirm the schoolgirl writers' aspirations and plans for their lives. The facilitators did not saddle them with the burden of being the representational evidence of born frees. Instead, they used somatic learning practices like Kapositar and Tai Chi. They had social workers and counselors on hand and provided short and long-term counseling to these schoolgirl writers to facilitate teaching them how to write what actually was happening in their lives. This seemingly innocuous thing, being a schoolgirl writer, is one of the most powerful sifting devices for identifying shrine builders. It can be found, in it can be found a sense of historical time and world consciousness, a willingness to serve as a cipher between the living and the dead, to record and document, to experience life while also thinking about its implications for others. To build a shrine means to stop living on everyday schedules and in everyday time, but instead to build with cosmological time. Teaching children to voice their power in this historically significant and world-building way translates the message that your dreams matter. Fatima Mir, the daughter of people who founded newspapers, who began her first speaking as a girl, taught her own daughter to teach other daughters of other people to write. For me, writing is a shrine. Thank you. First, I have this mask here. Oh. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. You just said I've been traveling. I don't know what kind of cookies.
Okay, great. Oh, there we go. Yeah. I hope everyone heard me because I can't say that again. I don't think it will come out the same way. Any questions or comments from the floor? Yvette?
Thank you. Can you hear me? So thanks, Tiffany, for acknowledging me. You know, I've often these days, traditionally, a traditional healer doesn't do politics. You might advise the chief, but you can never be the chief. And so I struggle a lot with what that means in the context of feminist activism. But thanks for the respect. At least it gives me a place to start. I'm like, okay, I'm that person. All right. I wanted to say, I think what might help you is, and of course it's been a hot topic with now, you know, in the US where it's now illegal to discriminate against an Asian, but it's still legal to discriminate against a Black person. If you say, I mean, like, yeah, there's context around these things that I can see why you need an answer. What I would suggest is to consider how Blackness reflects in India itself. I mean, you get Black Indians, South Indians, that I for one am descended from, Dravidians. And then you get Indians that do not consider, and it's a thing in India. And I guess my query would be how that reflected in Sis Fatima's life. I mean, it's fascinating with South African Indians in the struggle because unless you fully understand that Indian culture, you have no clue what they have rejected and what they have overcome to be these activists. It's deep. So that would just be my clue that looking maybe in that direction might be helpful in answering all these questions. Thank you.
I can actually, if I can offer something. I think that's why I wanted to have it in the room. Oh, okay. And also Professor Govindan's name, because to try to mark the thing that people have overcome. And so, like, what does it mean to tell a certain kind of story about her that doesn't sit inside that? So, you know, I was trained by Cedric Robinson, and he has this concept of the radical Black intelligentsia. It's kind of like, you shouldn't expect people to be co-opted and appropriated, right? You shouldn't, like, no one should be surprised by that. No one should be like that's what power does. It's trying to make you birth some horrible thing and then look in the mirror and tell that horrible thing, oh, you're wonderful, you're wonderful. But what we should pay attention to is those moments when people figure out a way, like every single day to become something else. Because you're not supposed to be able to become something else. And it's a really, really hard struggle. It's really, really a hard struggle. So I think that's part of where I'm trying to be inside. And I think even like, you know, Rahana sitting with that notion of the Kalapani, you know, the dark water, the black water, it helps think diasporically about the Middle Passage in ways that there's possibilities for thinking those two lines of inquiry. But, you know, at Irvine, you know, I've had a number of students, Shadi Malaklu colleagues, you know, Parisa Vaziri, who've tried to work on anti-Blackness in Iranian American communities, anti-Blackness in the Persian world. And it's very hard to sit with, because on the one hand, there's this desire for a kind of like easy third world left that's uninterrogated. But I want to be able for us to interrogate it, but it's about where I start that the interrogation happens. So I hope it doesn't feel like I'm just offering like something flat. I hope anyway.
Okay, I have a question about your larger body of work and your Black feminist praxis. So you referred to your location and what you hinted at what the work that needs to be done to be doing work in a transnational way, which is feminist and which is still without flattening people's stories or narratives, or flattening the idea of feminism or Blackness. And I've also encountered your work in the anthology Wild Imperfections. So clearly you are located in one location, but embedded in different communities of practice. And could you tell us a bit about how you build those communities and your praxis in terms of engaging from the US with in Africa around questions of race, Blackness, gender, sexuality?
Thank you. So, I mean, I think I didn't come to South Africa by mistake. Like I was sent here, you know, like I wasn't sent here by the State Department. I wasn't sent here by the Ford Foundation. Thank you very much, Ford Foundation. Like, but I was sent here by people who were exiles, who raised me to understand that my existence in the world as a Black person was not only in that geography and space, but belonged someplace else. And in every direction, whether it was from the people in the family that were from Duvalier's Haiti, or the people who had fled from the South, it didn't matter which direction, or the people who were exiles, the constant refrain is, this is not our home. And they meant this is not our home in terms of North America and the transatlantic slave trade, but they also meant this is not our home spiritually. So there's like another place that we're supposed to be. So that story is important because my first time coming to UCT in 1999 was mediated by mentors who were activists, who came here in the 90s themselves after having organized anti-apartheid struggle formations in many different places. So in Black London, across the Caribbean. And then they sent me to their people. So I didn't just go, they sent me to their people, right? And that I think matters. It matters to follow those kinds of introductions, yeah. But I think the other thing in terms of the communities of practice, I'm okay with not being the smartest person in the room. And I'm also okay with how uncomfortable it is to be in a room that has people of all different ages and people who are academics and people who are not academics, and people whose main source of social history is TikTok, and people whose main source of social history is Nombori Sagasa, right? And people who, refuse feminism altogether. And so in terms of practice, like I don't live in one kind of world. And that's been my praxis, but I think I just have been privileged to be able to be in that way. International research, we're told, I'll tell you this story. In 2010 or 12 or something, I evaluated for the 10-year University of California and University of Cape Town program of study abroad. And they do it every 10 years. And they had a financial reciprocity agreement between California and Cape Town that for so many US students came, a number of South African students or just UCT students should be able to go and travel there as well. And they were trying to account for the currency exchange rate. And they had amassed almost $200,000 here in the International Studies Office. And they were from UCT. And when I asked, the lady who ran the program over a very civil lunch, right? A very nice lunch, Yvette, very nice lunch, said, oh, they're not ready. They're not ready to travel. That's the same thing that they tell Black Americans in the US. You're not ready they don't want you there. They're not looking for you. You're not looking for them. You can't be in this conversation. In the academy, you can't be in this conversation internationally. You can't be. And I slept on people's floors and I slept on people's couches and thank goodness for it. And the people that I know are not the official people and they don't have all of this big name and whatever. And thank goodness for it.
No, I want to make a comment. I'm using my mic privileges. Your presentation is such an important one at this moment. For so many years, decades, that we've been leaning on the work of Black feminists from the US, and that has given us breath. And for you at this moment to be claiming, a South African Indian woman in the way that you are and saying you've done work that is, and you name, and you're not only with Fatima Mir, you have, Betty Govindan and other names here, and you're saying, sorry, but you're a Black woman, I'm claiming you, and I'm claiming the activism that you've done in the context of South Africa and not allowing this work to be in any way watered down. And this coming in time in this country where just in July we had the riots, and at the moment that there's protests that are happening and there's this popular discourse when people are on the radio saying, you don't belong there, you need to go back to India. And we're, it's like, what's India to us? We don't speak those languages. We don't identify with that space. This is the only home that many of us have ever known for generations. And so and I'm not saying that the community is not racist. But so then for you to reach across that sea and to grab us and say, actually, there's been work that's been done here, and I'm going to hold you as Black people. I'm going to hold you as African people. That is such a huge loving embrace that you're doing. Yeah, again, this just sets a tone for so much for what African feminism is about. And I just want to acknowledge that grace that you're giving us in the kind of work, because it's courageous work to say, I'm going to step in here because I can and because we must. And we can't allow the kind of decisiveness that's existing in this world to say, this is my place, this is your place, and all of that. It's like, this is all our places. I mean, even in discourse and in theory. So I just salute you for this kind of courageous work.
Thank you. So on the back of co-option and incorporation, and then on what Shadeen said about belonging versus non-belonging, like I wanted to find out from you, like how do you, like I often struggle with like who can write versus who can't write. So for example, I identify as a Black homosexual male, right? And then when you try and write, for example, about a certain someone, whether it's a particular writer that you like or a feminist and this, and you're told, oh, but then you can't, you know, and so I think I'm trying to how does one, I guess, check their quote unquote privilege? Because I mean, I'm thinking, you know, I was having a conversation with Shireen Hassim, who wrote a book about Fatima Mir, and she got a backlash about the book, you know, from some members of the family to say, but then you can write about our mother, because also, I think with historical figures, there's always like a narrative that is also just trying to be protected. Do you know what I mean? So I'm just trying to understand, especially trying to do creative work. So how do you as a creative person try to be creative, but then also trying to balance, I'm a man, you know, I'm told I can't speak on these issues. So that's what I often struggle with, especially in academia. You know, when you get feedback, you know, it's just, what am I supposed to do? Like, I don't know. Like, you know, you really lose your love for academia. Like, I don't want to, like, I've lost my love for academia in some sense, because, you know, oftentimes when you get feedback and you're like I'm tired. Like, how many times must I check my privilege? You know, so should I acknowledge my idea? Like, I don't know. Yeah. That's why even my question is all over the place. I'm sorry.
No, it's not at all. It's not at all over the place. I must have it. Okay. Okay, it's not a question that's at all over the place. You know, there's Beverly Guy Sheftile and Rod Beverly. I can't think. The book is called Traps. It's called Traps, and it's about proto-feminist Black men. And then Gary Lemon, who I think is one of the schools at Florida, has written a book called Brother Outsider. And there's a number of books like this. And all of them get us to some side of Tommy Curry's Man Not, or some side of Riley Snorton's, Black on Both Sides, because they kind of remind us that we're passing as men and women. Right, and we are more than that, and we come to that from the same things that make us try to prove that we're human through Christianizing ourselves, or prove that we're human by aspiring to whiteness, or, you know, like we're borrowing, you know, to use Frank Wilderson's language, we're using kind of borrowed institutionalization, or, you know, to use Lord's language, you know, the master's tools, right? In ways, and sometimes you have to use the master's tools, but, you know, like 50%, 60% of the time it doesn't work out, right? Okay, so when people are asking you to check your privilege, they don't want you to become Tyler Perry, right? They don't want you to give succor and they don't want you to create social worlds for people through, you know, extreme caricature and harm of other people, right? That's what they're trying to do. But they are inviting you to be, E. Patrick in Honey Pots. You all know that book, the Honey Pots book about Southern Black lesbians. It's literally called Honey Pot. Which is, you know, he's a performance artist. He published a book that was based on all of these ethnographies and interviews that he had done with Southern Black lesbians. And then he wrote a creative book, totally separate from that's called the Honey Pots book. I don't even know what the academic one is called. But the Honey Pots book is him embodying the stories of you know, both some of these women and also a kind of ideal type character that would be like their confessor. And it's beautiful how powerful the difference between him standing in his positionality and truth is, and Perry standing in a different positionality and truth. Like I might even read Tyler Perry and E. Patrick the same way that we read Booker T. Washington and Du Bois, right? In terms of like, how do we move forward? Well, we move forward by being able to employ lots of people and build a film studio and do all this stuff, or we employ lots of people by listening to them, all right? And telling their story in a way that actually changes what kind of stories we can tell. Yeah, but I don't think anybody else, and this I'm just talking not for other people in the room, but just for you. I don't think other people can tell you what you're called to do. And it's not just that it takes courage to do that, it actually takes surrender. It takes incredible, incredible surrender, because you're being asked to do something that other people are not being asked to do. And there's some small child out there that's, you know, going to somebody's terrible, rotten school or living in some like totally abusive household, who's going to come across something that you wrote or that you said or that you posted somewhere, and they need that. And so you have to be a cipher for the things that you're being asked to do, regardless of the feedback. Like you have to do what you came here to do.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. We've run out of time. Thank you for a wonderful presentation and engaging with us, writing as shrines. Thank you.